Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ann Lund coming to you from Haunted and Waiting podcast here on the Eye Opener Society podcast. First of all, of course, I'd like to thank Gary for having me host this little show on his venue. I really appreciate it. And if you don't know me already, my name is Ann Lund, and I like to share anything paranormal with a nice twist on hauntings and ghosts. So, on to our first topic today, and that is scrying. I've discussed scrying in my blog several times, but I wanted to do a little show about it for those of you maybe that don't know what it is. Recently on my TikTok channel, also called Haunted and Waiting, I discussed scrying, and a couple people wrote back saying, "My goodness, I haven't heard about that in such a long time." So I wanted to discuss exactly what is scrying. Now, I always like to share true things that have happened to me or people that are close to me in relation to all the topics that I discuss. And when it comes to scrying, I haven't necessarily had any experience with scrying, but I did have a dear friend who did. And briefly to explain what it was with her was we would go hiking and there was a lake at the top of this mountain near our home. And there was a portion of the lake that was under this huge oak tree. And in summertime, when you went there, and it could have been the brightest of days, the water under the oak tree was practically black because the oak tree was so huge that it cast a shadow on the water. So the water was very dark. And she claimed that when we would go up there, and we always sat under that oak tree when we would get to the top of this mountain, that she could see faces in the water. Um, this was probably about 20 years ago. I found it very strange. I would look into the water. The water was black. You couldn't see into it. It was just completely in shadow, but she claimed that she would see faces. And she would ask me not to talk to her, and she would look into the water, and that was about it. And I always wondered what that was. And I found out basically what she was doing was scrying. So um, scrying in general is when you use a dark glass-like surface. It could be a dark mirror. They do sell mirrors that are black. It could be a bowl of still water, which in my case, it was, like I said, the lake. It could be a candle flame that's flickering just enough so that you can kind of focus into the dark part of the candle. And for thousands of years, people have stared into these reflective surfaces, not to see themselves, but to see beyond themselves. And this was scrying, and it's one of the oldest and most misunderstood ways of accessing hidden knowledge. And in what I like to express is this ghostly images that you can get through doing this. So tonight we're going to explore some scrying and where it comes from, why it appears across almost every culture, and how it terrified religious authorities across the world, and why modern experiments suggest that it might actually work. Okay, so scrying is a form of divination that involves gazing into this like reflective surface. And through that, many people claim that they receive images, symbols, or messages. I myself, I like to meditate, and sometimes when I get into that sweet spot, doesn't always happen, but for those of you that meditate, um, there comes a point where you kind of disattach sort of from your own thoughts into the blackness, and you can start getting some images. And I think scrying is something like that. Again, I've not done this. I don't have the ability to do this. But unlike tarot or runes, scrying is very passive. So you don't manipulate the object, you don't move it, you just let perception shift into it. And again, some of the more common scrying tools are polished obsidian. I do have an obsidian stone that I use for meditating, but I hold it in my hand. I don't necessarily look at it. Black mirrors, still waters, wells, ponds, crystal spheres. Spheres will do that. Some people like to use smoke or flame or even like burning oil, or even shadows. I did do a podcast on where people see images through like faces in images. And a lot of people think that's pareidolia. But scrying can also be seen in smoke. And so I did have that experience. So if you're interested in that, you can look at my blog. The blog is hauntedandwaiting.blog. I do a lot of educational information there about ghosts and the paranormal. But in that, I talk about an experience where my dog was breathing. It was nighttime. There was a light, and the smoke, that was the mist that was coming out of her mouth. When I was looking, it almost looked like there was somebody standing there looking at her. It was very, very weird. So even shadows can be a form of scrying. And the goal is not imagination whatsoever. So you're not thinking this, it's what's coming to you through the images, okay? So ancient origins. Scrying predates a lot of written history. So in ancient Mesopotamia, we know that priests used bowls of oil and water to receive messages. Okay, they would look into it. It was also very commonly used in temple rituals, often involving children. A lot of people believe that children are spiritually open to seeing the paranormal. I also did a blog on that, on children and the paranormal. But children were used in these rituals. They weren't harmed, but they were used to like look into these objects to see if they could see anything. The Greeks also practiced something called hydromancy at sacred springs and underground caves, where they would look into the water. And there were several accounts of priests gazing into pools so dark that light could barely touch them and they would see things. The Celtic cultures, so the Northern European cultures, also used sacred wells and blackened shields before battle, believing that they would be able to see into the next world, get images from those who have passed to help them in wars. So across civilizations, we have seen this, the scrying through history. In the medieval times, scrying became a form of like religious fear. So by the Middle Ages, scrying was thought to be very dangerous, not because it didn't work, but because it worked outside of the church's control, right? So a lot of times churches, a lot of religions will put filters on what we should and shouldn't do. One of the most famous practitioners was a gentleman by the name of John Dee. He was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth, and believe it or not, he used an obsidian mirror, likely it's Aztec in culture, in origin, and it worked to record visions that he believed came from angels, and he would give these images or report these to the Queen. These things were kind of held secret, again, because it was thought to be somewhere evil, that it shouldn't have been allowed. But the messages that he got were very disturbing. And the entities demanded cryptic rituals and some moral tests. Eventually, Dee was branded a heretic and his work kind of disappeared by the Queen. So how scrying may work. So modern psychology offers some explanation. Scrying, they believe, maybe induces a trance state. So like I said, in meditation, I do sometimes get these images, and I can understand it. You're kind of detaching from your thoughts. And so it's believed, scientists believe, that maybe you're entering this trance state, and staring into something that has very little stimulus, very little light, may relax the brain's filters and set it into some kind of a default mode. And it's thought that maybe some symbolism or symbolic thinking rises, and the mind stops correcting perception, because there's so little perception there because of the limited light, that then imagination comes into play. But the problem with dismissing scrying as imagination is, why do people across time, cultures, and geography report the exact same experiences? They all report seeing faces, loved ones passed. They report seeing movement in a surface that's otherwise flat. Feel that scenes that feel external, like something that they wouldn't understand, wouldn't know of. So it's not invented. It's a truth that they may find out later on, that there's no way that they could have known it. Okay. And then of course there were some experiments. So you gotta love the scientists. They do the experiments, and I'm all for that. So if anybody follows Raymond Moody, he does a lot of stuff on life after death. And in the 1990s, one of the most compelling scrying experiments, he recreated an ancient Greek structure known as a psychomanteum. So what that was like a chamber or room used for mirror gazing to communicate with the dead. Now, Raymond Moody was very much into believing that there was life after death, very much. And he did a lot of experiments or recordings of people that had flatlined or died, and then saw what they saw in the next life and then came back to report it. So he was very much into that life after death sort of thing. And so he created this psychomanteum, which was something that they did in ancient Greece. And people were placed in this room, a dark room alone, and a mirror was positioned so they could not see their own reflection directly. They were instructed to relax and gaze past the mirror, not at it, but as if they were looking through it. He said no drugs were used, there was no hypnosis, no suggestion at all of what they should be seeing, and the results were actually shocking. Over half of the participants reported vivid visual experiences. Many saw faces forming in the mirror. Some reported seeing full apparitions stepping out of the mirror towards them. Others described seeing scenes, voices, or conversations. In my own meditations, I see scenes, I see rooms, I see cities, I'll see streets. It's weird, but they're very clear. And so this is what some of the people were seeing. Crucially, participants were told not to expect visions. They weren't told what was going to happen when they went in there, but this is what they saw. So psychologists observing the experiments noticed that the participants were all fully conscious. None of them had signs of mental illness. They didn't have any bias. They weren't allowed to speak to each other before the experiment. And Moody later concluded that the mirror does not create the vision. It removes the brain's resistance to perception. So what basically, in layman's terms, it removes the filter that we place on ourselves. Okay, it removed that. So whether it's psychological or paranormal, the experiment proves something unsettling, that scrying can be reliably induced, meaning if you're just willing to try and spend the time, you too can scry, okay? Let's talk about scrying in the modern world. So even today, spontaneous scrying does occur. People do report visions while staring into dark phone screens, staring into windows at nighttime. I have in my house skylights, and at night, sometimes when I look up at the skylight into the dark sky, I swear I can see something there. People do say that they see things in low light. Okay, a lot of children, when they start looking into the paranormal, a lot of like teen girls, let's say, they'll do the scrying in the mirror and they report similar things, seeing faces. Okay, paranormal research suggests that scrying doesn't summon image. It again reveals perception. So you're not seeing something new. You're seeing what's usually filtered out. It's always there, but we filter out. And the scrying, because of the lack of visual stimuli, is bringing it out. Okay, so, let's talk about fiction, because scrying does come out in fiction, and probably the most not common, but the most one that most of us know about are Lord of the Rings, right? Where palantír seeing stones do not lie, but they reveal partial truth, often driving users towards fear or madness. The detail comes from scrying. Okay, so in Lord of the Rings, when they're talking about it, it comes from ancient scrying lore. Okay, so the danger isn't false vision, it's complete visions. So in closing, scrying exists at the intersection of psychology, spirituality, and fear. And it asks a dangerous question. What happens when you stop looking at the world and start looking through it? Whether the visions come from the mind, the soul, or somewhere else entirely, scrying reminds us of something deeply unsettling. Reality may not be as solid as we think. It may actually be haunted and just waiting. So in closing, what are your thoughts? I'd love to hear. Again, if you've listened to this podcast and you can comment, I would love to hear your comments. If you have time, please find me on Facebook, Haunted and Waiting. You can also find me on TikTok, Haunted and Waiting. And of course, here on the Eye Opener Society, and especially on my blog, also called hauntedandwaiting.blog, where I'll have a transcript of this as well as links to resources for scrying, as well as true stories. And then when you're there at my blog, take a look at some other things. I do have some true stories in there, as well as some education, some paranormal education if you're interested, and I'd be glad to see you there. In closing, thank you for listening. This is Anne Lund with Haunted and Waiting.